by way of introduction, I'm Steve Hearsum, and I think most of you know me, but in this context, what I would say is I'm here in my role as, I guess, a researcher and author of, I hope to be published at some point in the future, a book on the theme of silver bullets, what they are in organisational terms and in leadership, and the extent to which there's a functional collusion between various parties that maintains the myth of the silver bullet. A little bit of contracting. Whilst we're here together, just to encourage you to be as fully present as possible, and also turn your notifications off if you can, mute when you're not talking. Because we are, most of us, I think, in the field of OD and leadership development, you'd be familiar with this, but I really would encourage you to be honest with each other, because we're going to be talking today, myself and Mark, very honestly about what we think and feel about leadership development and management education. So I encourage you to be honest, and nonetheless be respectful, even if you disagree profoundly with any of your colleagues here. Be curious and seek to understand. Now, a wee bit about technology. I'm trusting that you all know Zoom well enough after about 5 months of lockdown. And if anybody tells you how to use it, you're probably going to shoot them. So I'm not going to go into detail about Zoom. If you have any questions, put them into chat and one of us will be able to help. And by that, one of us, I mean everybody who's on this call, because let's treat this as a supportive group of people. However, the bit of technology you may not be familiar with is menti.com. So if you weren't on the previous webinar with Simon Kavickia, go to menti.com or use the app, enter the code you see there, and I will periodically be using the technology to ask you some questions. Okay, so hopefully that is enough for now on that. So the first question I'm going to ask you is to go to menti.com, and I'd like you to respond to that question, which is, what is your go-to leadership development model or theory?
Sorry, Steve, I've failed on, what's the code?
The code is 7323 008.
Thanks.
And as you enter them, we should see some things suddenly appear on the screen.
Steve, I don't think you're sharing your screen.
You should be, beg your pardon. Let me just, it should be showing, but if it's not. Okay. Thank you. Now that's interesting. Okay. So let me reframe the question live. When push comes to shove, what's your favourite? See if that changes it.
7, 3,
yep,
2.
then she only counts. Okay, Corral, thank you. Mark, if you feel moved, throw one in as well. Okay, interesting. So don't have specifics. Okay.
Sorry, Steve, could you just say the code again?
Absolutely. It is 7323 008. 7323 008. I'll put it in the chat. Okay. So that gives us a flavour of what's here in terms of our collective practice. And that's just to get you thinking about it. So let's move on. I've said a wee bit about myself. Mark, would you care to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. My name's Mark Cole. I do most of my work in the National Health Service as a leadership development manager for what used to be the NHS Leadership Academy and is now part of NHS Improvement. So that's where I've I spend my time, a lot of my time, in terms of thinking about that kind of challenge. How do we develop leaders? What does it mean in practice? Most of my career has been in and around the health service, and that tops up to 30 years. I'm depressed to say. So there's quite a long time doing kind of people development, workforce development, organization development. And these days, we deliberately left that question mark on, because I guess I'm at a point now where I've got a real sense of what I am. But I'm quite content with that. Whereas when I was younger, I probably would have cavilled and found some label for myself. I did manage to get a book out, as Steve said, and I'm really excited to be working. Well, I'm not working with Steve, but Steve shares bits of his writing with me. And the exciting thing for Steve and I is the way in which our ideas and our thinking and our theories, in lots of ways, interlock. So that's exciting. So the book that appeared this time last year is called Radical Organization Development, and I'm currently working with a colleague called John Higgins, and the publishers want to call the book Unlocking Leadership, and John and I are veering towards liberating leadership. So I think that's it.
Thank you, Mark. So, wee bit about the menu for today, a little bit about the project and where we're up to. Some of you have been on the previous webinar, so I'm not going to repeat what I said before, but I'm going to give you, in a sense, a flavour of where it's at. A wee bit of framing today. Oh, check the chat, Mark. Somebody's already, apparently your book title already exists. We're going to have some inquiry and conversation, which so the conversation between me and Mark, and then some inquiry in small groups and as a whole group. That's the theme of today. So a bit of context, and just to bring you up to date. I used this slide in the last session with Simon, and I guess the bit that I want to say at this moment in time, some few months after I've started this, is that the book is really evolving as I write it, as a interplay between my own experiences and what drove me to write it, and my growing awareness of what I see as the narrative that's out there. Somebody pointed out to me recently that the phrase "there is no silver bullet" is as much as the cliche as there is a silver bullet. So I guess my intent in all of this, and with this project, is to disrupt the narrative around silver bullets and to encourage us to see things as they actually are. And that includes myself, incidentally, let alone my clients or people I work with. This is the second in a series of webinars, and I'm grateful to Mark for agreeing to play with me today. There will be another one coming soon. Naomi Stamford, who you may know from the world of org design, has agreed to have some conversations with me, and that's got a different angle on it, more of that in due course. And these sessions are very much designed in the spirit of open inquiry. I'm making extracts of the book available for people to read. I don't see my thinking here as closed or complete. And I have already come across one person who's told me they have the silver bullet, so I'm going to be interviewing them soon. So we'll see whether or not they're going to be able to monetize that and sell it for a fortune. And that's probably it in terms of what I would say at the moment about the project, unless anybody have any questions. I want to ask you a question now, however, which is, what question does leadership development answer, in your view? And if you could enter your responses on menti.com, I'd be grateful. And as you do so, I will just share with you that that has proven to be one of the most interesting things I've cogitated on as I'm just going through again a redraft of the second chapter, which is about the role of leadership development and silver bullets. And Mark's feedback, along with that of another consultant called David Lyons, who's been equally generous with his time, has been incredibly useful. But the assumption that we know what question we're answering, or indeed that our clients are always clear on the question that they're answering, is actually flawed. So I think it behoves us, as those of us on the call are mostly consultants and facilitators. I know we have one or two clients side people. It behoves us to be able to answer this question from both perspectives. the question here which we have up, which is how should we define what a leader actually is in the workplace, is fascinating, because there's actually a huge debate about what a leader is and is not, and how it differs from a manager. And we can tie ourselves up in knots when we do that. And it's interesting that we see the phrase "they're a tool for enabling change," which I would actually agree with. My own bias is that leadership development is about change. Otherwise, why are you doing it? If all you want to do is put your people through a program and nothing changes, then it kind of begs the question, what are you doing? And we'll see as we move on, when we come to some of the critiques of leadership development, that is actually one of them, where one of the main issues actually is. So thank you for doing that. So, a little bit of context now and framing. So let's just, for a moment, consider the fact that leadership development is actually part of an entire industrial complex. It's not small beans. It represents a large industry. The scale of the industry in sheer monetary terms is huge. This is data from a website that looks at it from a US perspective, but they do also break it down into the rest of the world. I don't have figures for the UK or Europe specifically, but in a sense, that point is moot. It is a huge business. It does also then raise a question, if organisations are spending that amount of money on leadership development, how effective is it? The problem is there's actually much evidence that it doesn't. So Jeffrey Pfeffer, who's one of the most notable voices who critiques the whole field of leadership development, and I've just started reading his book Leadership BS, which I can highly recommend if you want to engage in some critical thinking around this. He talks about 3 factors that influence his thinking in terms of why they don't work, why leadership development doesn't work, period. So the first one is bad measures. So he talks about the fact there's not a scintilla of evidence that more people in leadership roles are adhering to the many prescriptions offered. That's a quote from him. And he also points to Bill Gentry, who's from the Centre for Creative Leadership, who reviewed the evidence and estimated that 1/2 of all leaders were failures in their role. So we don't have the correct measures. The second point, actually there's no credentials required. When I think about my entry into the field, what was I doing before I joined my previous full-time employment at Roffey Park? Well, I was a jobbing change consultant of some flavour. I joined Roffey Park, and then gradually I become inculcated into the ways of that particular organisation, and I learn how to do leadership development. But what credentials do I actually have? So one of the ways in which Pfeffer frames this is, he says that management and leadership, it's not a profession like medicine or law, and quote, anyone can claim to be an expert with no licensing, certification, or even experience required, nor do people practicing management, or worse yet dispensing management advice, need to show even the remotest interest in learning anything about the domain in which they are practicing, unquote. And the last one is particularly interesting, that we don't actually want what we say we want, because actually all the programs I am involved in are about helping people with communication and presence and impact and having better relationships and emotional intelligence. But field studies and experiments in organisations and settings of all types, including the military, actually suggest that narcissism and its correlates, including displaying even unwarranted self-confidence, are actually the path to career success. There's a total contradiction in terms. So this quote at the bottom is, there's actually something here about more hope than reality that I think really rings true for me. There's a whole load of flawed assumptions out there. This article was really useful, and Mark signposted it to me. But out of this, I'm not going to read this verbatim, but one of the most interesting things in this article that I pulled out and has got me thinking is that much leadership and management education is predicated on an individualistic approach, that we develop individuals, and we develop individuals to lead teams. But the reason that actually doesn't work is you spit people out typically without having addressed the systemic context within which they operate. So, for example, if you don't address the organisational structure and the way in which it is creating the current reality, and you don't address the reasons why people, for example, can't speak their truth and there isn't sufficient psychological safety, then no amount of leadership development will make any difference whatsoever. So fundamentally, there is a mismatch between what often it is framed as being addressed at and how it's delivered, and actually the best way to ensure that it actually works. And I actually commend that article to you to read. It's a really interesting read, and it's got me thinking quite profoundly about my own approach to how I work with clients when it comes to doing development. So lastly, a question here is there a functional collusion? So Martin Parker comes from a more kind of Marxist critical theory point of view. And he looks at this from a power point of view. So if you scan that quote, the bit that I've highlighted at the bottom resonated most with me. And in here, he's talking about business schools. And I very intentionally have framed this conversation today about management education as well. It's just the business school, but I'd also argue that leadership development with a capital L and capital D, and those of us that purvey it, we are also selling our own ideologies. And we are often selling it as a science, as if we have evidence for stuff, but often it's through assertion. So, one more question before me and Mark enter into a conversation, which is this one. Bear with me 1 second, once I use the technology. Who benefits from leadership development? Who actually benefits from leadership development? Interesting, the first two responses, it's the providers and it's the leadership development business rather than the participants. That's an interesting data set. That's fascinating. Okay, thank you for that. Really interesting. Okay. So bear in mind you'll get access to this afterwards to review at your leisure. So the hypothesis that me and Mark are going to consider and discuss for a little while before we then roll you into the conversation is this, that leadership development and management education are part of a wider functional collusion that fuels the quest by those that lead and run organisations for silver bullets and guaranteed fixes. So Mark, I'm going to draw you in here. Your initial response to that as a hypothesis?
I think it's a powerful starting point for a conversation about the whole issue of leadership and leadership development. And I think the silver bullet notion is the critical one here, because so much leadership practice, for me, notwithstanding its development, but so much that we think leaders are expected to do is about silver bullets. The leader, culturally, is still seen to be an individual who takes on a ream of data, talks to people, makes a judgment, and gives direction. And people might contest that because there are so many different versions of leadership these days. I read an article the other day that did a bit of a meta review of all the leadership constructs that have developed over time. And their simple conclusion was we add more and more of those leadership constructs to the pile, but we never drop any, so that leadership as a practice, or the underpinnings of leadership as practice, just grow and grow and grow. So I think the silver bullet notion is a really critical one here, because I think leaders spend a lot of time being told either there is a silver bullet or trying to seek a silver bullet. And so logically speaking, when it comes to thinking about their development, it's not a difficult leap to make to say there must be a quick fix for me as a leader to develop quickly.
So there's something in there, there's an expectation of speed as well.
I think there's a huge expectation of speed. So some of the work that Johnny Higgins and I have done over the last couple of months has looked at the chronology of business life. How do we work time in a business setting? So the first feature of that is the kind of 24/7 life, and there is a book called 24/7 that looks about how that has expanded. A second bit of that is about busyness. So we're all very conscious in corporate settings that the only position you can really be in is a busy position. And so you will constantly try and demonstrate busyness, which implicates a certain level of speed in terms of getting everything done. But I think for leaders, there's also a slightly confused trajectory around time. So in my experience, organizations tend to instantly disregard the past as somewhere where mistakes were made and the solution was not found. So the past is a place where there is no silver bullet because, as you say, there isn't a silver bullet. So we disregard the past. We don't talk about the present, but that's a critical area because that's where we sit when we're working organizationally. The present is where we are. And there's a concept called the specious present, which gives present a sense of duration as well. And I think that's quite an important philosophical element to get us to think about where we sit in terms of our practice and what we do. And then the future is just something that we're constantly thrown towards. So we have to think about the future, and we have to have a vision about the future, and we have to plan for the future. And there's a 5-year plan and a 10-year plan. And most of that is pure hubris. So I think that time issue is really significant, where the past is disregarded largely or is just plundered for learning points about failure. The future is constantly focused on, and the present is constantly neglected. But that's actually where things happen.
So one of the things that occurs to me as I hear you talk, and it goes back to one of the comments that somebody put in on menti.com a few minutes ago, that the purpose of leadership development, or the question it answers, is actually one to do with change. Now, if that's the case, the assumption, therefore, is that change in organisations happens primarily through leaders and leadership. Is that true?
Well, you're asking me to make a grand assertion, so I will say, I will make a pronouncement. That is simply not true. And I think most of us know that's not really true. So my view, just on the basis of my practice, is that the authentic shift and change takes place at a grassroots level, very often in small ways and ways in which might aggregate, and that what might happen in a kind of leadership cadre about a transformation program, and that's invariably what they're called, tends to be something that doesn't actually achieve what it thinks. But there's a secondary point here. If you look at the work of somebody called Robert Cheer, he talks a lot about time, but he also talks with some of his collaborators about the notion of change and stability. And that's a traditional binary opposition in organizational life. So Christensen, when he's talking about innovation, makes that contrast about how does an organization stay fleet of foot while still being stable. And Cheer's argument is actually the natural state for organizations is perma-change, it's constant change, by which it doesn't mean it's an imposition of change, but that when we sit amongst others and try to organize together and do things differently to serve a particular purpose, that is a process of change in and of itself. And that the artificial sense of organization is where somebody then tries to impose some stability on it. So where a leader says, actually, I'm going to button this down and make some change happen, that actually runs counter to what we know as people in organizations to be the key feature of organizing.
So if I shift then to the people who provide leadership development, and my own kind of working hypothesis as I write is that, and I speak now from the eye of somebody who, in various guises for the last few years, has been a seller of, provider of, deliverer of leadership development and management education intervention. And I think about the ethics of that. And some of the things I've been reading has led me to really question my own ethics and question the integrity of some of what people like me do. Because if you follow the logic of the evidence, which is that actually for development intervention to be genuinely impactful and to make a difference across time, it has to first of all be seen in the context of the systemic intervention and addressing the conditions within which that takes place, the most obvious one being psychological safety and the extent to which actually it is permissible to speak truth to power. Then any program or intervention that I choose to sell in or sell to a client that does not start with a conversation along the lines of, I'm not willing to do this piece of work until we've had the conversation about how we're going to address the systemic context within which this sits, is actually colluding. And and that's being kind of at the most gentle level, but more fundamentally is actually unethical, if I'm aware of that tension.
Yeah, I think that's what took me to a point where I wrote the book about radical OD, because I was conscious of my practice as an OD practitioner left me feeling slightly compromised in terms of the way I was starting to think about the activity in organizational settings and what commissioners of that service were asking me to do. So I think there is a sense of, if we know these things to be true, if we actually are cautious around terms around truth, but if the truth claims around a huge amount of money being spent on leadership development and not much impact for it, if we take that truth claim to be correct for us, then it is an ethical issue, and a subtle one as well in a capitalist society, because eventually the dull compulsion of the economic overtakes many things. But it is an ethical issue about how we would then approach that work. So I did a session yesterday with a trust, and they wanted me to run, rather grandly, they called it a leadership masterclass, which again made me slightly uncomfortable. But I was happy to do it. And they wanted to have a look at their values as an organization. And as we had the conversation, it was clear that what they wanted was a kind of justification of the values work in the way in which they'd done it, a bit of an exploration of it, but a reassertion that values matter. So it's a kind of refreshment session. And so I said to the people I was talking to, it will be really interesting to do this piece of work, but actually my first point of view would be the NHS over the past 4 or 5 months has experienced quite an interesting dissonance between what organizations say are their values and what we've seen as practice amongst leaders and managers. And I said, my view, if you want this to be an authentic session and you really want to think about your values as an organization, you need to start the conversation with the participants about the extent to which the values have been upheld and lived in the course of a crisis, because ultimately for an organization, that's the most testing time. So I think for me, it's a tiny, tiny step, and I'm never going to publicly cut my throat and just stop working. But I constantly have a second voice in my head around my practice, which says, whose interests are being served here? What power is being served here? And would I be colluding with that power in a negative fashion if I took this piece of work at face value? And how far can I push the work so that it can accommodate to my ethical position?
Got it. Okay. And if I was to shift the focus for a moment to, because I use the term, we use the term in the setup of this session of management education, which then takes us into arguably the sphere of business schools and exec ed. Is there anything in that domain that actually is particularly relevant to this functional collusion?
I think there is. I mean, you and I have chatted about these things. So my starting point for these kind of things is we tend to default to a question like, what is leadership? And my question is very often, why is leadership? So to what extent does leadership connect? To what extent does our close affiliation to the notion of leadership relate to other socio-economic issues? So what does it mean that we suddenly talk more about leadership than we ever did before? What does it mean that leadership as a kind of executive development issue has overtaken management, whereas previously that might not be the case? And I wouldn't want to historicize that. I'm not saying, this phase then this phase, but I do want to think about why is leadership. And so its appearance is really interesting to me. And so the whole discussion we're having, if we went to the headwaters of the debate, it is, why is leadership? Why are corporations wedded to this notion of leadership rather than thinking about management, when actually, if you look at most organizations, the day-to-day business of getting them to run successfully is management, it's managerial. And I had shared with you some reading I've been doing. A guy called Mark Learmonth and his collaborator, whose surname is Morel, published a book last year, which it's quite academic, but it's a critical leadership studies book, and they take a really careful position in terms of saying we previously used to talk about managers and workers, and just in terms of setting up that concept, there's a tension there. There is a sense in which a manager, in terms of managing a corporation, may find issues at root that the workers would not necessarily agree with. So it has an imprint of industrial relations and potential strife in the workplace, because it gives a clear sense that there isn't a shared picture for everyone in the workplace. There is the management and there is the workers. And so you're back to films like I'm All Right, Jack and such like, which are well worth a revisit these days. And yet suddenly we now talk about leadership and followership. And it strikes me the presupposition underneath that remodeling is that it's one of the myths of management that John Higgins and I are working on, which is the notion that we're all in the same boat and that we're all trying to achieve the same thing. And actually what it does is to rub away the fact that there is still resistance and reluctance and antagonism in a workplace setting, but we use the term leadership and followership because it presupposes that everyone's on the same page and doing the right thing.
Yeah.
So you don't have a leader and workers, you don't have a manager and followers, because those two don't work. But you do have a leader and their followers, and it presupposes that everyone's buying into this magic vision.
The last thought before we move to get people into small groups is I interviewed somebody who's a very senior HR leader in an insurance business, and her comment to me was that in their business, the L&D function and the exec signed off the total development budget they had to send 5 general managers, so senior leaders, off on exec education programs. So, and her view was, we've just blown all our development at vast expense on highly expensive exec ed programs on the assumption that these 5 people are going to have an impact. And how might that money have been used differently to develop more people? Which talks fundamentally to this issue of, well, unless you address the systemic context within which you make your choices about how you develop people, then you're just replicating the power inequalities and the existing culture. So let's just change things out. We're going to throw you into breakout rooms with a simple question. How do you reflect upon and think differently about the assumptions and thoughts you came with, having heard what you have so far? Or not, as the case may be. You may think not at all differently. So we're going to give you some time to do that. You'll be in groups of 3 or 4, and I'm going to open up the breakout rooms now. And what I want you to do now is just, before we get into a kind of plenary conversation, is if you'd be willing on the menti.com website just to share your main reflection. If you have what's most present in your mind as a reflection from your conversation, and share it with the group as a nice. There's a difference between leadership development and developing leaders. Yeah. So one of the things that I've written about is, leadership development, the noun, capital L, capital D, and leadership development, lowercase, which is the activity. And I think the two sometimes get conflated. I like that one. Leadership development needs to be done as part of culture development. And actually, interestingly, I think one of my underlying assumptions in the work I do is always to make the connection with culture. For me, the two just go together. I notice I'm sitting here wondering how anybody could possibly think the two aren't connected. Nice question. What is leadership and can it be developed? Well, the answer, I guess, is you can develop the person and they may develop leadership capabilities in inverted commas. How do profiling tools collude and who decides what makes a great leader? I haven't got profiling tools in the book actually yet. That's a good one. I might have to add that. Thanks to whoever put that one in.
Steve?
And that one there at the bottom middle, leaders in the system can and should be aware of their influence. This can be developed. Yes, I think that's true. But that then loops me back round to the question of psychological safety and how okay is it for me to be influential? What permission is there for me to influence? So lovely. So the intent now is just for a few minutes to throw this open to us as a group before we close. And anything that we're a relatively small group, so anything that you feel moved to share or reflect, or you want to ask me or Mark or each other as part of our plenary. Or are you also blown away by your breakout room conversations that there's just nothing left to say?
Hi, Steve. It's Ed here.
Hi, Ed.
Just a quick one from me is I really appreciate this opportunity to have some critical thinking, because I'm not really a critical thinker. I'm much more of I always see the positive in things. So to have a bit of critical stuff is really good. And I got the same thing from Mark's book. I don't know if you remember, we had a chat after it, Mark. So yeah, just really good to be critical of stuff. So I think your thinking and writing and talking about this stuff is really good thing to do for people like me who just see the positives and everything and just roll along with it. So
well, it was interesting you say that, because there's a part of the rhetoric of let's say OD practice. I speak now as in my role as co-chair of the OD Network Europe, and I'm associated with the field of OD. And I think part of the shadow is that we talk about ourselves as being critically reflective, but I actually wonder how often we think as deeply and as critically as we could, and ask the hard questions about our field, our practice, and ourselves. So I think it's a really important point. But the same is true from a client side. We in a sense have permission to do it because OD invites us to think critically. How critically do, for example, HR functions or leadership development L&D functions think when it comes to fielding a request from an exec to develop a cohort of leaders? So critical thinking is something for me that is fundamentally underplayed and is often paid lip service to, because to think critically means asking uncomfortable questions of self and other.
And just adding to that, Steve, critical thinking is one thing, and then bringing that into a client conversation is hard, particularly if you're seen as critiquing a way of thinking that maybe is not working, or I'm trying to get to some underlying assumptions. You're dealing with other people's identities and businesses.
Well, and I think what you get into there, Julian, is what kind of a practitioner or consultant do you want to be? So one of the people I interviewed earlier in this process was Richard Clayton. And if those of you who are not familiar with him, I encourage you to find his work and find him on LinkedIn. And one of the things that Richard has written about and talks about, and there's a blog post, I think, from 2017, and where he summarises this idea. He talks about dirty consulting. So we were talking about how big consultancies collude with their clients in offering very neatly packaged models, theories, programs that talk to the reassurance and the managing of the client anxiety. And that's part of the functional collusion, and that's selling a silver bullet and meeting that need. And he was advocating a form of dirty consulting. I said to him, well, what do you mean? He said, well, the dirty consultant, the difference is a traditional consultant will come in with something neat and something well presented. And I did this. I've done this in my previous role. I come in with a nice, neat PowerPoint. It looks beautiful. Even if I'm asking hard questions, it's still presented quite neatly. The dirty consultant comes in and says, look, I don't know what the problem is. And I'm not going to know the problem is until we go and talk to a few people. Once we've had a conversation with a number of your people, we might be able to work out what the problem is. And together we might be able to work out what we do about it. But the key point here is there is no collusion with doing that neatly. It is intentionally going in with a dirtiness to it and a quality of, I don't know-ness. How can I possibly know? How can you possibly know? How can we possibly know until we've had that inquiry? And it's actually influencing my practice at the moment. I have a piece of work that I may be having a conversation with a client about next week. I've had the initial brief. and I intend to go into that conversation with that in my mind, which is how can I inquire with that client and not collude with what feels to me in the brief like, what some of the language was, we need some support around this culture work. Oh, okay. Okay. Well, you haven't told me what the problem is. You haven't even been able to articulate what the problem is in the culture or what the question is. So how can I possibly offer you anything coherent?
Problem is, Steve, the whole tendering system doesn't work for that often, does it? Well, certainly not for big consultancies.
Yeah, and I know, Emma, you've got experience at PwC, and that's the dance, which is, and some of the interviews I've done really reveals that, which is big consultancies actually choosing not to take the ethical and the valid approach to challenging a client for fear of losing other programs of work. So the ethical dimension is profound, and it's very easy for us to slam business schools and big consultancies. And I think that's one of the myths. I'm saying this again as an independent now. I think a number of us need to take responsibility for our behaviour and our ethical choices when we bid for work and how we choose to engage with our clients. And that's part of the conclusion around leadership development. We're colluding with the idea that leadership development has the answer. I'll get down off my soapbox now.
I think that's there for internal consultants as well. So speaking as somebody who works within the business that employs me to do it, it's almost a similar pattern that you have a choice about whether you're showing up with your business client, your internal client, to say, here's what I can do for you, and you collude with what you know they're looking for and give them the nice shiny answer, or whether you go in and, as Steve was saying, do the dirty consulting, saying, I don't know what you need, but I can come in and help you work it out. And how often as an internal consultant do you do that? Because, you're being paid to be there to do it, but are they going to want to work with you, and are they going to still employ you to do it? That all those tensions are there whether you're internal as well.
Yeah.
Which is why,
it's an ethical question for us too.
Yeah, and that's why much of the work I do with internal consultants, whether they're OD, HR, change, is talking about their capacity and their capability to speak truth to power. Because unless you can do that, how are you going to shift that? So I'm conscious it's 3 minutes to. So if it's okay with you, we're just going to do two last things. I'm just going to tell you very briefly what comes next. So what comes next is I will send out to you the recordings of both this session and the one on Monday, and they'll be available also via my LinkedIn profile. There is a newsletter for the project as well, and that you can find on my periodic updates on LinkedIn, but I'll also make sure it's shared with you through sharing the recordings. The next sessions after the second one with Mark on Monday will be with Naomi Stanford, who you may know from the world of org design. And Naomi and I are going to be talking about her experience of being a practitioner and an expert, inverted commas, and what it's like to be framed as a guru, and what role does she see that silver bullets play in the client system she works in, and what are the practitioner and consultant implications, and very intentionally talking to somebody who is a name in her field and how that changes the dynamic. And the very last thing is, if you're willing to, is just to share your thoughts on how today was for you, so that oops-a-daisy, that if I need to, I can reframe Monday and me and Mark can come dressed in different attire or wearing silly hats or whatever it is you would have preferred us to do. So even a one-word response would be fine. And apart from that, all there is to say is thank you for your time. And if there are any last thoughts, we've got 2 minutes to go until 5 o'clock. Me and Mark are always happy to have some conversations. My thinking has changed a lot in the last 6 months since I've done this. I'm also going to send out to you, as part of the stuff, a link to a survey which is designed to gather quantitative data to go alongside the qualitative data I'm getting from interviews with people like Mark. So I'd be really grateful if any of you have the energy to fill in the survey, and please feel free to share it with whoever you want, because I want there to be a mix of both qual and quant data to support what it is I'm writing about. So that will be the other thing, just to say I'll be sending out. So feel free to do with that as you feel energized to do so. And that's it. So thank you very much. And I will see you all hopefully in the real at some point, if Boris Johnson ever lets us meet as human beings in the same space again.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Steve
Mark.
and Mark.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Look at that. Bang on 5 o'clock. Like a
Fantastic.
well-oiled machine.
Remarkable. It's like watching a TV producer. Amazing stuff. Amazing stuff.
Good. I think it's interesting that I think I might see if I can create more space for them to talk in the breakouts. I had that with the ones with Simon. So I'm going to try and I'll have a think about how I can do that. Maybe shortening some of the setup. But yeah, I think that went well.
Yeah, I think it's a good group, and I think I was reminded in terms of their conversation that I'm just working through